Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. And remember, if you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? I'm Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, where each week I speak with experts in the fields of technology, science, finance, and culture to help you gain the tools to better navigate an increasingly complex world so that you're less surprised by tomorrow and better able to predict what happens next. My guest this week is Thomas Reardon, CEO and co-founder of CTRL-labs, a company working at the intersection of frontier disciplines including computational neuroscience, machine learning, and biophysics that builds transformative neural interfaces which can easily be confused with something straight out of science fiction. You gotta see it to believe it. Reardon's career before starting CTRL-labs is no less impressive. A founding board member of the World Wide Web Consortium, he's famous for having created Internet Explorer at Microsoft, which at its peak represented 96% of all web browsers in existence. Over 1 billion people on Earth have used his software. After leaving Microsoft, Reardon decided to go back to school, receiving his undergraduate degree in classics from Columbia, gaining fluency in Latin and Greek, and followed that up with a Ph.D. in Neuroscience split between Columbia and Duke. It's hard to capture the paradigm-shifting nature of the innovations stemming from the work being done at CTRL-labs without seeing it for yourself. Anything that I can say is insufficient to capture the awe of watching someone type on a screen without moving their fingers, use their intentions to pick up and finally control objects in three-dimensional space, or play a video game while remaining visually motionless. The implications of this technology are perhaps rivaled only by the practical genius of its implementation. By focusing their attention on translating only the final neuronal output of our brain's commands as expressed through electrical impulses sent directly to our muscles, the team at CTRL-labs has managed to create a device that can capture the brain's intentions non-invasively through the use of a simple armband that you can wear like an article of clothing, a wristwatch, or a fancy bracelet. It's not an exaggeration to say that this technology turns yesterday's future into today's reality, blowing wide open the world of immersive computing and expanding our sense of possibility beyond our wildest imaginations. And with that, let's get right into this week's episode. Thomas Reardon, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me.
It's awesome having you on. I told you this was one of the most difficult and easiest episodes to prepare for. Difficult because this is really what you do is at the intersection of technology, kind of information science, neuroscience, and robotics.
And beyond.
And beyond. So there are a lot of fields that it covers, and it's so new that what you're doing, the field in general, I think, sort of the people that are doing this, that putting the pieces together, but there's not much information about it out there, so there wasn't much I could do, so I didn't get too anxious about it.
I'd say we're creating the field as we go. I don't think there is a field quite yet.
So in that spirit, because I do want to get into your background also, but before we do that, maybe you can give us a sort of a background of what it is that CTRL-labs, first of all, maybe you can tell us why the name CTRL-labs and what is CTRL-labs?
Well, it's control and it's CTRL, just like it's on your keyboard. It was really meant to be a tip of the hat to the hacker that I grew up as. The idea that we wanted to increase human control, that we've spent decades letting machines increasingly dominate our lives, letting digital experiences dominate our lives, but we haven't gained more control over them. If anything, the last decade or so in the post-iPhone era has been sort of a regression for humanity of less and less control.
Now, do you mean control in terms of the server side or in terms of the client side on the user interface?
I mean, control,
user experience.
Broadly writ from the human subjective perspective. Do I feel like I have control over these machines that are around me, or do I feel like they have control over me?
Oh, that's very interesting. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that that was part of sort of the mission. I was thinking about it much more in terms of UI and UX.
That's a piece of it, but it's really much more about how we want to change the rules by which we extract information from people, or more importantly, allow people to express their intentions to machines, to computers, to robots, and have those things do what people want.
Oh, that sounds amazing. That sounds way better than what we have now. So we're going to circle back to that. You mentioned you were a hacker growing up. You were also, as I understand it, the youngest of 10 biological siblings and one of 18 kids total.
That's right. Yeah.
Did you grow up on like a farm? Where did they fit all these people?
No, we grew up in a mid-sized city in New Hampshire. Believe it or not, there are cities in New Hampshire, and I grew up in one of the two real cities in that state.
Were you guys half of the city?
Just about. It felt like that. Certainly it felt like that way mentally.
But that's really cool. I mean, what was that like growing up in such a huge family home?
You know, this question comes up in so many different social contexts, and I try to explain to people, I can't give you what it was like because it's just so different than any other family experience. So much so that I don't actually believe it happened to me.
Do you have to go like with anthropologists and visit Aboriginal tribes to get a sense of what is similar? Do you think that's closer to what your family was like?
Like a collective experience.
New Guinea?
Yeah, just, most of the way you experience families in the world is through other friends' families. So your own, if it's aberrant relative to the way the rest of the world works, suddenly doesn't even feel like it's real. It was a crazy way to grow up. We were highly incented to get jobs. I'll just say that. So I left home when I was 15.
As a result of the fact that you were in such a large family, or?
Yeah, pretty much. I think there was just a lot of pressure to kind of move up and out quickly.
Pressure that was exerted from the top down, or just part of the collective of all the different siblings? Because I imagine, for me thinking about it, is that there would be a culture within your family that is far more difficult to direct from the top down in such a large family than there would be, let's say, in your typical two-child home.
Yeah, I would say it's more of a, most everyone in my family, I think, had a sense of having to get out of the house because of what we'll call resource scarcity. You got to go make your way quickly. You got to make room for the ones behind you. I think that was kind of the attitude.
So there are other questions that I would love to ask you. Maybe in the overtime I can ask you about those, because it is such a fascinating thing to think about. And in some sense, it seems enviable. I know everything has their pros and cons, but there seems to be something really awesome about that, especially as you get older, that you have all these siblings. One practical question, though, is how did that experience impact who you are today? How did it shape who you are, and how did it shape the type of leader you've become in business?
Oh, boy. So I had this really crazy experience. Not only am I rare in the sense I'm one of 18, but the way that it happened. So I was the baby of these 10. And when I was 11, 12 years old, we adopted 8 kids that were scattered around foster homes across Massachusetts. Yeah, all at once. And they were all just younger than me and then all the way down. So the oldest of them was 3 months younger than me. And it was this crazy transition where I went from being the baby who, gets to make the baby demands to being the older brother who has to kind of tend to the flock. And it was a really odd kind of switch in my life that both made me feel like nothing is permanent, nothing is stable. Mm-hmm. But also, I don't know how to describe it. I don't know many people on earth who've gone through that kind of switch in family roles. That it put me in a position where I think I'm a fairly empathetic leader. Although I would also say many of the people who work with me say I tend to tune them out too easily.
Tune them out too easily?
Yeah.
What does
that
mean?
It means, I have built up filters to interruptions.
Oh, interesting. You know how to create solitude for yourself.
Yeah,
amidst
exactly.
the noise. Also, it sounds like you know how to scale pretty well.
Yeah, nice.
You doubled your family size in overnight. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating.
Went from 1 baseball team to 2 baseball teams. Yeah.
That's amazing. Did you guys play baseball? Did you actually play family baseball?
No, I wish we had. I don't think we ever pulled off a single game, but we should have.
That's so interesting. Okay, so that's fascinating. Another fascinating thing that I heard about you, less remarkable than some of the other things, remarkably enough, less remarkable. You were taking graduate courses in mathematics at MIT when you were in high school, And as I understand it, you didn't go to college initially, right?
I didn't. So I was doing, I don't know why it says mathematics. I did take classes at MIT when I was very young, comically young, 13, 14, in computer science. Like that's where I first learned Lisp.
What year
way
was
back
this?
in the day. That would have been 83, 82, 83. I was quite young. I was able to do that because that's really kind of where the hacker culture was born, was, you know, in Cambridge and in Massachusetts. Also, you know, obviously it happened in the West Coast around Berkeley, et cetera. But there's just this kind of great inviting culture around hacking at MIT. And I want to make clear, when I use hack here or hacker here, I'm using it in a very reverential way. I'm not talking about the contemporary term hacker as we think of as somebody who breaks into systems. The term hacker as I grew up was as I say, a term of reverence, and really was about classifying somebody's skill. Like the most skillful programmers were hackers as I was growing up.
Autodidacts, able to navigate creatively.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what made you decide not to go to college? That's a risky move.
That's another part of, I did 1 year away that was a failure. Like I said, I left home when I was 15 and then ended up moving down to North Carolina after that, and basically was just not socially mature enough at 15 to really.
So you were working on your own, supporting yourself at the age of 15, living away from home.
Yeah, that's crazy. What's funnier about that is I actually had to forge my birth certificate to pull it off.
You had to forge your birth certificate?
I did. Well, it's fortunate because the year I was able to make a slight change in the year because the working age at the time in New Hampshire was, if I get this history right, was 16 and I was 15. So I forged it to say I was 16 so I could get a job. Did
you look your age? I mean, it's 1 year, but
I was
that's
6
a big,
feet
those are
tall.
like dog years.
I was 6 feet tall. I was 14. So
Okay.
I was able to I think I was baby faced, but I could sneak through on Hide Alone.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like I said, that's the kind of thing that was sponsored kind of out of my family, which was sort of, you know, resource scarcity. So therefore, pull out whatever tricks you need to get done the thing that will get you out of the house and get you thriving. So forge your birth certificate, no big deal.
Modern day pioneer, sort of just going off into the software wilderness.
Yeah.
So you started, as I understand it, so you didn't go to, I suppose in the context of what you're saying there, it's not that surprising or meaningful you didn't go to college because you were not even living at home. So you were already kind of out on your own, and you, as I understand it, started a company before you went to Microsoft, right?
Yep. So I started a company in North Carolina with some other folks. We ended up selling it to Ann Winblad, or really to another company, but Ann was tightly involved in the deal. And Ann introduced me one-off to Bill Gates afterwards. So I had a miserable time after that company got bought, but Ann kind of redirected me to Microsoft.
You had a miserable time because you didn't know what to do?
No, because the company that acquired us didn't know what to do.
Oh, that's frustrating.
And I mean, that's quite a long time ago. And, you know, I was young and it just, like I said, it like I left that after about 6 months and ended up at Microsoft in kind of a two-step.
So she introduced you to Bill when?
She introduced me to Microsoft is probably a more accurate way of saying it. And I would say that was 1990.
1990.
And that's when I ended up going to Microsoft.
So you were, we did an episode on the history of the early web.
Yeah.
Which started pretty much, or at least our episode started with Tim Berners-Lee.
Yep.
And then quickly moved to Andreessen and Mosaic and Netscape. And you guys came up in that sort of Godfather meeting, something like that. That's popularly described.
Yeah.
I don't know how accurate that is. But I'm curious how... And there was a memo that I had in that rundown where I had pulled that Bill Gates had sent to all the employees at Microsoft once he sort of kind of got the internet.
Sure.
You know? But I'm curious how you went from going to Microsoft to leading, basically being the first person on the Internet Explorer team. I mean, you're generally credited with creating Internet Explorer. How accurate is that?
I started the project. Of course, you know, like any big, serious piece of software, it grew to be a huge number of people, and another person was brought in to manage it as we went to shipping it. But I did get it started. And as part of that, really, I took on a role as the sort of overall architect for internet client software at Microsoft. So that was everything from, you know, the browser itself and all the languages that are embedded in the browser, like CSS and HTML and XML. So as part of that, it's how I became friends with Tim Berners-Lee. I was one of the founding board members of the W3C when we got W3C started in 1994. And then, yeah, I was there from the day zero of IE all the way through to the antitrust suit.
So that must have been difficult too.
Yeah, it was miserable.
We don't have to get into all of that. But one of the things that I do want to get into, because for me, trying to get into your head and think about you as an entrepreneur and as a creator, and when we're talking about control labs, you created a piece of software, you led the team, or you were part of this Herculean effort to become the dominant browser on the internet. You guys at some point, I believe, had 96% market share, right? Over 1 billion people were using Internet Explorer.
Yep.
That's enormous scale. That's sort of like very few people in the history of humanity have ever experienced anything like that.
Yeah.
What was that? What was that like?
That was a thrill. And it's a thrill that's hard to not want again.
That was my next question. You read my mind.
When you're building software, you want people to use it. Why else would you be building it? I guess you could do some things for your own, meditative happiness, but I cared about people using the software that we wrote, and I cared about making it excellent and winning by some measure. And, we said that we called it browser usage was the metric we were going after. It's a thrill. Like, you just...
Talk to me.
It's a thrill not just because of that crazy scale, but like it's humbling. It's just really humbling to learn how people interpret something at scale like that, when it really goes diffuse around the world, when it leaves your own local culture and goes out, say, to the American culture broadly, and then goes from that across the world. And you start to see like how you imagined it being used is not the way it's actually getting used right away. And then it mutates into some other thing. But you're able to live kind of right at the center of that, not so much controlling it as it is that you just get to absorb so much information, and it changes your thinking so rapidly. It's the most thrilling learning experience you can possibly go through. I imagine, people who've worked on like massive political campaigns, like for president or something like that, have had that kind of experience where it's hard to give up that kind of buzz.
I was going to use that example because that is the closest thing I could think of where, let's say you're the candidate's number one guy or girl, right? You're the person that's been with him or her from the very beginning when this was literally just a dream. Yeah. And now you're in the last year of a presidency that has sort of transformed the country or whatever else. And you said something earlier, and this is sort of what resonated with me, that you had an idea of how it would work, and it's not at all how it works or how people are using it, rather. Just this idea that you had a private relationship with something before anyone else knew about it, and then it had just become this Leviathan that the whole world had a relationship with.
One good thing about going to Microsoft when I did, like I got there before Windows had happened. I make the joke that I was hired, this was actually the truth, I was hired to work on a project called Windows 93.
I didn't know that.
We were a little bit late. And that was like the end of 90, beginning of 91. And the thing that happens inside of that culture is, at least then, it was a really self-critical culture. There's a lot of dark parts to that. But I found that kind of self-criticism and humility like really kind of, again, humbling. We always had this idea that like you're going to start in one place, but there was always this confidence. We're going to do a version 2. We're going to do a version 3. Like, what's the dialogue we want to have with the market? How do we want to set ourselves up to learn and respond? How are we going to learn as this thing mutates, as people actually use it? And Microsoft's a pretty magical place with the way it listens to developers, listens to creators. It doesn't always get it right, but it really has a really fascinating process and just culture for talking to developers and learning what to go do next.
How so? Do you think that's reflected because of the fact that Bill Gates has often said that if you opened up his brain inside, it would just be software? Because he was because
Bill's a developer at heart. And that just the very first things that Microsoft shipped were like development tools. There wasn't an operating system. It wasn't DOS. The first things were development tools, the basic language and things like that. It was just a very developer-focused company, and believe it or not, at one point in time was sort of a very hacker ethos company. And now that has completely transformed into something else. When I was there, we had this kind of saying that like the software that you're working on right now is the coolest thing ever created until the day it ships. And then it's the biggest piece of shit you've ever seen. And if you can't digest that and live on that and thrive off of that, you have to have unbelievable confidence to do the next one and unbelievable humility to move past it.
That's great.
Anyways,
that's great.
I think of that a lot when I think about what we're building today with brain-machine interfaces, which, my goodness, couldn't be more different. But the ethos of building could be
No, that's
same.
fascinating. That's great. So you left Microsoft eventually. You started another company. We don't have to go into that. But eventually you got tired of, as I would say, crushing the internet. And you decided to go back to school. This I also found equally fascinating. You decided to major in classics. And as I understand it, you're fluent in Latin. I don't know if you're fluent in Greek, but you obviously would have studied Greek. How did you decide to go study classics? I mean, it's almost, let me just tell you this. There's almost kind of like in my mind, you scaled the heights of success in technology and software, and it's almost kind of like you went in the exact opposite direction. You wanted to see sort of how advanced was civilization at the beginning when we had the most advanced civilizations that we had in the ancient world.
You have great insight into how I was thinking.
That is
how
it?
you have that, but yeah. I would say that combined with the fact that I had grown sick of the web in almost every possible way, it had in no way lived up to Tim Berners-Lee's sort of dream. You know, it was founded out of CERN, a big physics research institute. It was how we were going to go create networked machines to go help us think through the evolution of information and knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge. And instead, you know, the greatest successes on the internet were sort of sports and porn, and the kinds of technology battles we were having were just not interesting scientific or computer science arguments. They were, you know, about how to increase ad revenue the fastest. And those technology problems were utterly disinteresting to me.
As the web had scaled, you're saying? Because you'd already solved the major sort of technological hurdles, and now you were focused on the monetization and how to squeeze more out of it.
It's not so much that I was or that Microsoft, it was just that's where the world had gone.
Right.
And I just wasn't interested in those questions. I just needed both a break and something to really rewire my brain, and I went and did the thing that I thought would be the furthest possible thing from a tech career. And that was, you know, move to New York, register at Columbia, and put my head down and study classics, which is what I did.
Had you had any experience or familiarity with the classics before that you made that decision?
I had this really embarrassing encounter with one of my idols, with Freeman Dyson, the legendary physicist. I had to have a lunch with him when I was sort of struggling with what I should do next. And I asked him, you know, about some of the things he had done in his life, and he mentioned reading classics regularly and reading Tacitus, and I was really interested in that. And I said, you know, my Latin isn't that good. I've tried to teach myself a little bit, but I'd really like to read Herodotus. And he said, well, that's great. You do know Herodotus was Greek. And I was like, oh, shit.
Wow.
I should have known that. That's embarrassing, blah, blah, blah. And I just said, like, okay, next time I see Freeman Dyson, I'm going to know Latin and Greek.
So you read Herodotus in Greek?
I did.
And you read Tacitus, I'm sure, in
Herodotus
Latin.
is hard. Tacitus in Latin, also very difficult as authors go.
You get a real sense of dysfunction when you read Tacitus.
Well, just as language, he writes in this spectacularly dense Latin way. Like the Greeks don't write this way. The Latin authors write in this very, very compressed fashion, but he's the most compressed of all. At least of all the prose writers. What you get out of dysfunction is sort of political dysfunction.
Right, yeah,
because
exactly.
Tacitus is obviously writing about Rome
Comical,
during
very
the post-Augustan Rome. And he's dry and fascinating. But you mentioned something which is absolutely true, which is, you know, what you learn about what the common questions were then and now, and the common questions of sort of political organization and family. And you know, they have a very different conception of family relative to my family. Like family is much adopted as born in the Roman mind.
Right.
And those ideas were really, really comfortable to me. There's a lot to learn there. I don't know what it is actionable other than things haven't changed much in 2,000 years.
How do you feel what you studied in college, how did it help you both personally and professionally? Are there ways in which studying those classic works has advanced your ability or increased your creative capacity or anything like that?
I wouldn't say it's done any of that. I was trying to put a smile on my face and read as much as I could and read it with a lot of other brilliant people and see if I enjoyed the simple process of learning alongside other critical thinkers. And I loved that process. And that frankly led me to grad school in a whole other field.
Right. So you were part of the early web, and then you moved into doing classics at Columbia, and then you decided to go do your Ph.D. in neuroscience. I think you were split across Columbia and Duke, correct?
That's right.
Well, what drove you to do that? You had your period where you were baking and you did your 4 years or whatever where you just let your mind kind of go somewhere else, and then you came back and you decided what it was that you really were interested in?
Yeah. I needed that time to be able to kind of stew and find out whether or not the problems I had worked on up to that point in my life were really the problems that I cared about, or were they just the ones that allowed me to get a paycheck the fastest. So I did the biggest reset I possibly could and tried to be much more deliberate about the next investments I was going to make with my life. I started to become attracted to questions of the brain. Like a lot of people, these were more questions of the mind and consciousness. And that led me to, during my time studying classics, just to volunteer to work in a lab at Columbia and expose myself to contemporary neuroscience and kind of down at the level of single neurons, not the psychology end of neuroscience, but the kind of deep biophysics end of neuroscience. And once I started hanging out with those people, I started to realize they were the kinds of people that I was fascinated with in the early 80s who were hackers. These were very big-minded people who they were able to bring to me that we had started to crack part of the code of the brain. Mm-hmm. Not the code of consciousness, but really about how the brain works at an almost mechanical level or an electromechanical level. So
would you say that was the common thread or the theme, that what attracted you to the work you did in the early days of the web was that you've said this a few times, at heart a hacker, and that hacking was for you what was your passion, what drove you, and that you found a new place where you could hack anew?
That's why I had fun doing the Ph.D. I mean, I did a bunch of molecular biology, which was absolutely, what I'll call genome hacking. I did a bunch of work on neurotropic viruses that was really fascinating to me, and not commercially viable, but fascinating work. But it was all in that kind of hacker spirit. And I think, the best young scientists have that kind of spirit. You can be very formal and over-proceduralized in science, and God knows, I say the vast number of PhDs, frankly, are the transferal of bones from one grave to another. But the best are creative hackers who kind of rewrite the rules of, the rules that they received. So I don't want to say that there was this clear arc to go into neuroscience, but what's more interesting, I think what really happened is that by studying classics, I gave myself the confidence that the academy wasn't locked away from me because I had skipped college when I was younger. And that, boy, once I was sort of in the academy, I was like, okay, what's the most interesting problem happening in this entire place?
That makes sense.
And that drew me to neuroscience. And I now had the confidence, both because of my Microsoft arc and then having actually studied something more seriously, undergraduate, that I could actually go and do something productive there. I mean, a lot of that is just having that confidence that, where you came from is not a limitation, but sort of where you're going is the only limitation.
Right. It's also interesting that you broke out of that box. A lot of people, they get stuck in one sort of domain and they try to innovate within that area. But I find that the greatest innovations come from as much interdisciplinary contact as possible.
Oh, good Lord, is that true in neuroscience? And I want to emphasize, neuroscience, as we know, it was barely a term 20 years ago. It's not this well understood cohesive field with a monolithic text that you just go and read. Neuroscience is the ultimate interdisciplinary science. It just requires end to end everything.
Why is that?
Because we're trying to understand the complex behavioral output of you, this 15 billion neuron computer, all the way from the scale of individual synapses up to speech. We're scaling across so many different phenomenological levels. It just requires basically all of science as we've known it to date. I mean, the amount of people, statistical mechanics is a hugely important thing, from physics that now comes into in models that are used in solid state physics are used to model neural behavior today. The borrowings into neuroscience come from chemistry and biochemistry and physics and particle physics and computer science and psychology and cognitive psychology and sociology. It just comes from so many different places. It comes from applied math. It comes from some crazy places in pure math. There's just so much because ultimately we're trying to figure out how thought happens.
What's at stake is more important, perhaps. Also, I mean, your focus is going from outside of yourself, building these machines or building these computers or software to inside, to saying, how do I work? How does this brain that I have work? How does this all come together? I mean, I'm sure that that's intrinsically fascinating. I'm going to pull, this is sort of a hodgepodge that I put together of a description of control labs from various different parts from your website, other areas. And then I want to ask you something about it, and that'll be, I think, a good way for us to get into this. Control Labs is a startup that develops devices capable of translating electrical muscle impulses into digital signals. The company dedicates itself to answering the big questions in computing, neuroscience, and design so creators can dream. The team's work to build a transformative brain-machine interface spans research and challenges at the intersection of computational neuroscience, statistics, machine learning, biophysics, hardware, and human-computer interaction. So there at the end, what you were just saying, but my question for you, and then we can see where this goes, that stuck out for me was answering the biggest questions. What are the biggest questions that you and Control Labs are trying to answer?
How much control you're capable of, how much output you're capable of.
Explain, what does that mean?
So here's the thing, and this is really born out of my Ph.D. and the learning I did in that, that was 7+ years of my life. Human input is incredibly rich. Your ability to absorb information is sort of unbound, whether it's visually, auditorially, via touch and proprioception.
And you're including also scientific instruments that you can use to obtain further information?
No, I'm just talking about your natural ability to take in information is extraordinary. You can process a crazy amount of information in parallel, all towards a goal of a final behavior, ultimately a movement. What's crazy is when you actually go to move, when you actually want to output from a human, you have to do it via your muscles. And your muscles transduce the sort of electrochemical output of the brain into forces and movements. That is an incredibly slow process. It is low bandwidth, high latency, and error prone. Our brain is a remarkable evolutionary, I'll call it, invention. Our muscles, I think I'm broadly speaking less impressed by. We're working on that problem to make the output from you match the input to you. We want to extract as much information out of your nervous system as possible such that you can have the kind of control over things in your life that mirrors how well you perceive all the things in your life. Today, you mostly express control with your hands, and you do that. I'm watching you with a pen as you write notes on that piece of paper. And I'm just going to say that is a comically low bandwidth output. Comically low bandwidth, using a pretty old technology there. Your ability to kind of read in all that information, read that thing in front of you, watch me, be aware of the room around you.
Trust me, it took a lot of practice.
Complain about the temperature in the room, all this stuff. It's because you're always integrating all this information simultaneously, but your ability to do something is incredibly limited. There's no reason why 5 fingers is the natural output of your brain. It's just a, evolutionary kind of, I'll call it a stump. What is exciting to us is this idea of giving you 30 fingers on a hand, or the ability to rotate your hand 360 degrees. Like, there's no reason to be limited by what your body can do. Your ability to actually do things.
That just freaked me out, what you just said. I just started thinking of my wrist turning inside towards my arm.
Oh, I don't want your hand to do it, but I want your virtual hand to do it, your robotic extension to do it,
there's a phantom loop. So this is, to me, we're now getting to the part, like I said, there's not much information there, so I had to do a lot of just imagining on my own. But this is where what I find most exciting and also most interesting and fascinating, how you've done it, your decision. So this is probably, I'm not sure where we'll go here. There's an interesting point about neuroplasticity I'd like to go to, but there's also an important distinction between two particular modalities. I don't know what you call them, electroencephalography and electromyography. You've decided to use EMG, which is electromyography, as opposed to EEG. I found your explanations about this fascinating, and I found the practical nature of the decision to do that and its implications to be probably the most interesting thing that I read about. So what was your original vision when you decided to create what is traditionally called the brain-machine interface or a brain-computer interface. I know you don't like those terms.
Yeah, we prefer the term neural interface because brain-machine interface has too much of a connotation of cortex and sort of what's up there on the top of your skull. But of course, your brain is a giant organ that starts at the top of your skull and cortex, goes all the way through the old brain, if you will, and then down into the spinal cord, and your spinal cord is still part of the brain. Although
the old brain is the base of the brain?
Sure, we'll call it there. You can have, things from the mesencephalon up. What we call the telencephalon is the very top of the brain that are the evolutionarily new structures like cortex. Then as you go down from cortex, you sort of go into evolutionarily older things. And arguably the spinal cord is the oldest of all. The spinal cord is the output port of the brain. This is where your brain actually sort of does its final act. Your question is, why did we go down this path of EMG? And it came down to something where we said a couple of first principles. One, boy, it was sort of odd to us that there wasn't really much happening in the world or had happened to commercialize all of the great discoveries of neuroscience. So I make the comparison to sort of Genentech in 1975, where they sat at the end of 30 years of pure bench science that had been investigating DNA and RNA and the structure of proteins and how proteins are created and all of this molecular biology to restriction enzymes, et cetera. But nobody had sort of put it all together and said, okay, we can now start to create novel forms of life. Like we're going to create a company that does genomic engineering and synthesizes new proteins. And that's the birth of biotech. They basically took 30 years of bench science that had been totally unexploited and rolled it all up into one company. And I thought there was a similar opportunity for us to do something that epic, that there are decades of neuroscience that are sort of unexploited, a lot of experimental tools, a lot of experimental results that we could go and do. Now, the second part of that would be, how could you do it in a way that would matter to 8 billion people? Because from my perspective, one of the problems with academic neuroscience right now is not the practitioners. They're some of my favorite people in the world. It's the practice itself, which is really focused on pathologies. So if you go into a typical academic neuroscience lab, they are funded because they're working on Parkinson's, or they're working on ALS, or they're working on schizophrenia. What you don't hear people say is like, oh, I'm working on human happiness. I'm working on empowering people. I'm working on giving people new extraordinary abilities. I wanted to be on the other side of that. I didn't want to create technology that was for 100,000 people or 1 million people. I wanted to create technology that was for 8 billion people. Right. And that really reaches back to my Internet Explorer experience. I really said, I want to turn this all on its head and make a run at creating technology that are for 8 billion people. Now, in the neural interface world, you have to make a decision right away. Are you going to be invasive or non-invasive? What that means is, are you going to require surgery or not? And we said, of course, we're not going to require surgery. So what technologies are available to us to go get signals from the brain, from the nervous system that don't require surgery? One of them is EEG. There are others. We are, broadly speaking, skeptics of EEG
So explain EEG just sort of superficially for those listening.
So EEG is a technique for reading out what they'll call brain waves. I'll tell you sort of by analogy. So imagine you had a microphone and you were standing outside of Giants Stadium during a football game, and you held it up and you could basically tell whether or not a touchdown had been scored. You might be able to tell which team scored. Beyond that, you have no idea.
Signal-to-noise ratio is extraordinarily low.
Yeah, you have to go through the skull and skin, and more importantly, all the muscles themselves around the head are generating electrical fields, and you're just getting basically a kind of a global state of the brain. And it turns out that things like surprise or fear, writ large, are giant signals in the brain. So you can kind of detect those. I wouldn't want to drive my car with EEG. I wouldn't want to do anything more subtle than say like, I'm in a panic. But that's about what EEG is good for. It tells you global brain state.
No one knows the pattern or the signal for type the letter P on a keyboard.
Yeah, I say it. We're working on the problem of a microphone that in some sense sits kind of right up against the stadium, but I can tell what somebody in section 34, row 12, seat 5 is saying to the person right next to them. Directly. That was our big bet. We couldn't do it when we started the company. It took us 2 years to be able to do that. But the idea is non-invasively to be able to listen to single neurons inside the body. That was the great big proposition. Can you hear, virtually speaking, a single neuron without putting a probe into the brain? And it took us several years to pull it off, and we can do that now. And that is the kind of core breakthrough that we bet on, we've pulled off, and that's what we're building on now.
So between the mapping part of this and the hardware part, or the being able to actually extract the messages non-invasively, was there one challenge that was more difficult than the other, or did they kind of go together? Or is it different?
I would say this, getting the signal out is a hard problem. The signal that we get allows us to see thousands to tens of thousands of neurons, and we need to disambiguate all between them. We have to be able to tell which one is which from a kind of a mathematical perspective. We can separate them out into their constituent signals. All the neurons together, all shouting together, create a big, huge electrical pulse, but we can break that down into each of the little component neurons. The harder problem for us actually was, and remains, and will always be, the machine learning side of this. So most of the company, we are 65 people now, most of the company work in what I'll call modeling and machine learning, what in the field we call computational neuroscience. And we build these spectacularly subtle, complicated models that allow you as a person to quickly focus down on just a few neurons that are effectively talking to this machine learning algorithm to translate the activity of those neurons into action somewhere. So like, I want to be able to pick up that pen that you're holding in your hand and write down some letters with it. And I want to be able to do that. I'm not even going to move to do that. And this is something we can do today, basically typing without moving by generating little pulses of electrical activity through the nerve that don't provoke movement.
So, okay, invariably I'm going to get lost here, but hopefully once I start getting lost, we'll need to get back on a trail because I don't want to lose the audience. How does that relate to the two regimes of control that you have? Is that neuro control what you're describing?
That's what we call neuro control.
Neuro control. Myo control is kind of right out of the box.
Yeah, we didn't introduce those terms earlier. So we talk about two kinds of control, myo control and neuro control. Myo control is basically just us working at the level of what we call gross EMG, or basically muscle activity. So imagine anything you do today by moving, swiping on a screen, typing on a keyboard, using a mouse. These are all movement-based, and myocontrol is our ability to read out the electrical input to the muscle, the synaptic activity onto the muscle from neurons, and recreate the movements that would have been there. Once I know those movements, I can redo kind of virtually whatever you would have been doing. So for instance, I can have you type without the keyboard actually being there. We call all of that myocontrol. That's not properly what a neural interface technology. It's more of a muscle interface technology. And we broadly call that biomimeticism or biomimetic action. So things that require you to move or do things as if they were your regular natural task, like writing. I'm
curious about something. So the other thing is I was thinking about when I was reading the stuff and looking at some of these videos, you have to see this stuff, A. B, I had reached out. It was a little, this is a last minute thing, but I would love to come by your lab at some point and test these out because I feel like the next level is actually testing it. Yeah. But I've seen, for example, you or other people typing on a table just with your fingers, and that translated directly to a screen. It wasn't any cameras. That was literally the electrical impulses that were being read, that were being translated into code on a screen. Yeah. Is that where you've mapped specifically like this movement for like the letter Q or whatever? You've mapped that particular movement, or is it to a level of sophistication where the software can actually read the nuance of the movement? So if you're slightly off, it's not.
That's what makes it so great. I try to talk about this. Now, imagine you have a keyboard and you're always adjusting. If you go up to a new keyboard you've never done before, you adjust the way you type so that your hands fit the keys properly. But imagine instead of you adjusting the keyboard, imagine if you are the keyboard. And maybe you start by typing like it was a regular QWERTY keyboard. And instead, let's say, you're like, keep screwing up the P key. So one of two things can happen here. Either you, the human, can learn how to hit that awkward P key. So I happen to have a weak right pinky and it's hard for me to hit a P key accurately. if you don't learn it, then the machine has to learn it. Now, if it's just a dumb keyboard, it's not going to learn. But a machine can learn if we teach it to learn. And that's exactly what we've done.
That's the neural control. That's separate.
This is part of Myo control and neural control. It's just we use those terms to talk about the signal level that we're talking at. This is at the level of muscles. Neural control is at the level of individual neurons. But they both involve this, what we call co-adaptation, the ability for a machine to learn and give you feedback and have you collapse down. You sort of approach each other in agreement about what's right and what's wrong. So now you're typing, and you know what? Forget it. There's, like you just said, if I'm just doing a very subtle movement with that right pinky, that's fine for a P.
How does the machine know that that's a P?
We train it pretty rapidly.
So you're training. This is something where you would sit and you would train.
When I say train, I am talking about things that take less than 60 seconds. It's not days of training. It's not like the first time you learn to type.
So this is kind of like sitting in a car seat and adjusting the seat?
I would say that, but I would say it's more like if you were adjusting the seat, but not because you put your hand down there and moved the seat and said, I like it right here. It's more like every single time you get into a car, it's like, oh, I know you. I'm going to adjust here. By the way, the environment you're in is slightly different. So I'm going to move you over a little bit. And just by watching the way your body subtly shifts, it changes the seat automatically.
Fascinating.
You don't have to explicitly move that P key to make it more approachable to you.
Wow.
We just nudge it along in that direction.
Holy shit.
That's kind of the coolest part of this. We call it co-adaptation. We're not the inventors of that idea, but we are the biggest exporters of it.
Just to kind of put a little small summary on that point, your vision in this particular example that you're giving is that you throw away the keyboard. Right now, we're all using one thing. We're all going to a keyboard. So we're using a keyboard. The keyboard, we structure ourselves to this device.
Absolutely.
You're basically inverting that. You're saying we all get our own keyboard.
Correct.
And it adjusts to us.
Correct.
That's fascinating.
Not just is it sort of adjusted to you, it is the most personalized technology in history. I am not overstating that. You cannot be more personalized than this. This is personalized to your nervous system.
All right, so I don't know exactly now where to go in this conversation, so I want you to continue. All right, you're talking about the keyboard. Walk me through, because like I said, this distinction between Myo control and neuro control stuck out to me, but I didn't fully understand it. A lot of really fascinating things seem to be what is Myo control. I don't know how you want to approach this conversation, but I'd love to hear more about the sort of innovative stuff you're doing here and how you're doing it.
So, we're neuroscientists, and the great question of neuroscience is how do neurons ultimately do their work and lead to behavior? Everything from, as I said earlier, speech to twiddling my fingers to tapping on the table to eating to whatever. All of that is done by neurons. Neuroscientists ask the question, how did information get into the brain, i.e., how did you sense it? What happens to the information in the brain? And then how do you output it? Turn muscles on and off. Neurons are at the heart of that, and we spend our entire lives as neuroscientists trying to figure out what happens in between that input and that output. And we want to do that at the level of a single neuron. That's ultimately the goal. Or now we collect them together. No one single neuron does everything for you, but they all together collectively regulate your behavior. And we have these very complicated models that talk about different parts of behavior and how some collection, we call them ensemble of neurons, accomplishes that. Neurocontrol is where we meet that level of neuroscience. So think of Myo control more as sort of control theory and human-computer interaction work and kind of changing the game so that we're not talking about physical devices. We're talking about always morphing devices, these virtualized devices. Neurocontrol is the same goal, but at the level where we're using signals from individual neurons. What's important about that is that you don't have to move in anything like the way you move today. In a lot of our demos, you don't have to move at all because you're actually generating an electrical pulse, an action potential down, a motor axon. It terminates on the muscle. It's a single neuron, and the activity of a single neuron is unlikely to provoke actual muscle action, the contraction of the muscle. It takes a lot of neurons firing a lot of signals for the muscle to actually contract. When you're down in that regime where you're not really moving at all, you can still control things. Like call it using the force. It's a little bit of a joke on our part, but we really mean it. That's what it feels like. We have some games that we have people play, and really you will sit there and play this game.
I've seen one of them, Asteroid. What is it? Asteroid Hunter?
We've done Asteroids. We've done, some like goofy, our preference has been 80s arcade games, actually.
Well, I've seen one demo where you have the person has his hand, I don't know if that was you or I think it was your co-founder, maybe in that one. And he has his hand right next to the smartphone on which the game is being played. Yeah. And he's controlling the spaceship.
And that's a high degree of
without moving his hand at all.
That's 2.5 degrees of freedom in that game. Those are, the technical
But during that time,
terms.
neurons are firing.
Absolutely.
From the spine.
Yeah. Sometimes that results in some of his muscles twitching. Sometimes they don't. But we don't care about the movements. All we care about is the neural signal.
So that seems like, help me understand how I would know what...
Yeah, you don't know right away because you've spent your whole life learning how to be you and how to use your hands. So I want to emphasize this. You're a human being. You have the most extraordinary motor skill of any life form. Extraordinary. You think a cat doing its little flip when it gets dropped is extraordinary? It's nothing compared to what you can do with your hands. The fact that I can close my eyes and touch my fingers together with my eyes closed, all based on proprioceptive information only. The way that I take a sip of water from this bottle and compensate for all the complicated motions of the liquid, something a robot
can't do without even thinking.
Without even thinking.
Right.
I just do it. Like, this is what we're evolved to do. We have extraordinary motor output capacity. The job of control labs is to take that unbelievable learned capacity that you have and apply it to the way you interact with machines, the way that you interact in life effortlessly. That's what we want it to be like to work with a computer. I want to get to this thing about when I said this about learning. When you were born, you didn't have this ability. You spent the first year of your life just waving your limbs in the air, what we call motor babbling. As you tried to find out how your body worked, it turns out you were probably doing the most important learning you'll ever do in that first year. All you were trying to do is figure out very actively how to move your hands and limbs. We give you feedback at Control Labs to let you, in some sense, go through that process all over again. What's it like to be a baby and do those kind of explorations? So basically, we give you feedback, and it takes, for the kind of game you saw for Asteroids, it takes about 5 to 8 minutes of training to figure out how to control it without moving. And that's because what's really happening is we're not just trying to take a signal from you and make the machine do something. We're trying to get you and the machine to negotiate. For instance, in that game, there's left and right, not just left, right buttons, but how much left, how much right. And there's go forward, go reverse.
Oh, man.
How much forward, how reverse. We're trying to get you and a machine to rapidly agree on what makes the spaceship go forward, what makes it go back, what makes it go left, what makes it go right, how to go fire missiles from the virtual space machine. That is co-adaptation, and that's kind of one of the most important, if not the most important thing we're working on.
Well, there's another thing that you bring up in your sort of this, what I read, a distinction between adaptability and plasticity, which I found super interesting. So you're saying that all of this is happening on the level of adaptability.
Absolutely.
This does not require any change in your brain.
No, you have this capacity today. Now, I'll say, as you do increasingly complex things, it probably does require plasticity, but in the same way that like learning to play the violin requires plasticity.
Right.
And when you learn to play the violin, you're taking in a bunch of information about how much pressure to apply through which fingers on which strings and how to, coordinate the rhythm across the bow. We're trying to have you go through that experience now with a machine that's much more abstract, but faster.
Is the distinction between plasticity and adaptability in this example about skill level and also about remembering how to do an action?
I'd say at a neuroscience level, when plasticity generally implies something structural in the brain. So something happened at a synaptic level that changed the connection between two neurons. When we say learning and plasticity, we mean it in that context. But there is a bunch of other adaptation that can occur without a structural change in the brain. In other words, think of it this way. You've learned, as I said, when you pick up that bottle of water and you take a sip, you don't have a program that is been pre-written to pick up that bottle of water and bring it and take a sip from it, because that bottle of water is different every sip you take. You have to constantly adapt and change your hand shape, the amount of load that you have to compensate for in the bottle, etc. You can't make new synapses to do that on the fly. You sort of have a menu of these commands that are embedded in your brain that you can quickly swap in and out adaptively. And that's what we mean by adaptation. Using a bunch of the capacity that's already learned in your brain for a wide variety of tasks. Mm-hmm. Plasticity is something that we don't really work on or depend on, which is the structural change on the brain that allows you to learn and consolidate the learning of something you've never done before. But it turns out most of the motor things we're talking about are things you have done before.
So let's say I wanted to learn how to type without a keyboard and without actually typing.
That's the easiest one in the world, because I did that and it took me 0 minutes.
Well, not the example I gave before. I mean, without actually using your fingers to type. Yeah. Is that what you're talking about?
What ends up happening, and this is why I love the technology slope that we got on, if we didn't plan for this, it's just been an unbelievably positive outcome for us, is people start by doing what they do naturally. So the way I learned it was I just let the machine watch me type. And then I just took my hands off the keyboard and continued to type. And the letters just kept coming because it was like, oh, that looks like what you were typing before. Mm-hmm. It basically mapped the movement of my fingers to what I had done on the keyboard. Mm-hmm. But then what I noticed was I didn't have to move as much to get the same keys. In other words, I didn't have to reach all the way up for the P. I could just reach a little bit less and less. And what ends up happening is, yes, you relax and you move significantly less all the way to the level of effectively not moving. I want to be careful there because somebody who's measuring EMG would, what is movement? Is there a muscle contraction or not? It's sort of irrelevant. Your subjective experience is you are not moving, no more than you are moving when you breathe.
So you learn how to type with physical feedback, right? That's how you learned originally how to type. Yep. How important was the physical feedback in being able to do that? And the question is, once you learn this other way typing that's overriding the previous sort of function, how does that does that deteriorate your skills that were associated with traditionally typing? And so do you have to be careful? In other words, this is a larger way of asking, do you have to be careful and choosy with what you map to what behavior?
We're not far enough along now to answer that question. It's an awesome question.
You're still just hacking.
We are still just hacking. It's an awesome question you're asking. And it really gets to the question of, like, in some sense, your question implies that even just asking the question implies like that you think there's a limit, that, oh, the nervous system is at its peak when it's typing. An argument is, well, that can't possibly be true. If anything, it's a kind of stereotypy of movement, stereotypy, I guess that's the word, that way underuses the amount of skill you have in your hands, and that the amount of skill you have in your hands is 5 orders of magnitude more than typing can capture. Therefore, the idea that doing this more subtle version of typing without moving would erode the really simplistic thing that you learned before. You may think it's complex, but relative to what your hands can do, it's nothing. Now, that's our first principles response. We have no data to back that up right now, and whether or not there's skill erosion in the natural tasks.
When I'm dreaming and I'm like flying around or doing something totally off the wall that probably can't even remember, very few dreams I can remember like that, but I think most of us can remember some dreams where we're doing something that's physically impossible. Is that basically saying, look, the only reason that I can't do that is because I'm constrained by my physiology, not by my imaginative capacity in my brain and by well, in this case, there's also the neurons in the spine that have an impact here. But, I mean, how much more potential, you're talking about we're output constrained, we're not input constrained, 10x, 100x, how much more, I mean, obviously you don't have an answer, you don't know exactly, but is there some general idea you can give me for just how much more potential we have to act on our environment? Well, at least
using the way that we're doing it right now, which is at individual neurons, I would say there are 14 muscles in the arm that control the hand. The hand itself is kind of dumb, but the forearm is what actually controls the hand. Those 14 muscles, again, have more nerve dedicated than any other part of the body. By far the most nerve. You have a picture here, this thing called a motor homunculus that shows you how much nerve is dedicated there. Even for that, there's only about, we're estimating on the low end, probably 15,000 neurons that collectively control the hand. And that's, assuming 1,000 neurons per muscle or so. And that's coming down from a brain of 15 billion neurons. So what you can think of is sort of your brain collapses down from a crazy place of complexity down to really relatively low complexity, still 15,000, but low complexity. And those 15,000 in turn drive 14 muscles to move your hand. So there's this crazy collapsing down of complexity on the output side. That's not true on the input side. And if we say 15,000, I'd say, well, that seems to be the limit. Today, you've got 14 muscles you seem to be able to control, not quite individually, but close enough, I'll say, that, avoiding questions of what we call synergists, but extensor and flexor activity across those 14 muscles. Potentially, you could go from 14 to 15,000. That's quite a big expansion.
Wow.
More intriguing for us is being able to do that without stopping movements. Like the cases that we care the most about are what it would be like to be moving and doing this and looking at my watch, but also typing on it without moving. In other words, using neurons that aren't necessarily required for movement to do all of this other form of control, but then allowing them to help you move as well whenever you need them to. That's a really kind of abstract concept, but that's ultimately what we're trying to get you to learn how to do, is to use neurons in ways that you've never used them to move before.
So you guys have already released your SDK, right? We
are sampling right now. So
January, was that when you started sampling? I mean, it's very recent.
We were sampling a little bit last fall, but we are just really sampling right now.
So where are you at right now? And also, what are some of the most immediate use cases that you think can be applied or will be applied in this technology?
So this technology is for everything in the end, but that's a terrible business plan. You got to start somewhere, and it has to be incredibly focused and have high utility, and you have to solve a problem. I think we're solving this problem of, human sadness in a digital world. But again, that's a great vision statement. It doesn't get you the first couple of checks. So our first...
That's your first slide on the slide deck.
The first thing we talk about is opportunities in immersive computing. So this is VR and AR, where all this work was done to create new ways of getting information into you so that you feel like you're in a virtual environment, or that the virtual environment is all around you in the augmented reality case. But nothing was done to make it easier for you to interact. The first Oculus Rift shipped with an Xbox controller. I mean, that makes no sense. That's completely absurd. So I know the people in that field, the best thinkers in that field, agree with me, and they think we need to do much deeper things to have rich interactions between people and these immersive computing experiences. So we feel like we solve a fundamental problem that's so fundamental in VR and AR that it can ungate those markets today. Those are not hugely exploding markets. A lot of people have a lot of belief in them, but they're not happening right now. Virtual reality is not a real deep market right now. We think we solve the big unstated problem of virtual reality, which is how does a person actually do something?
Long term, does this kill enhanced voice? Because one of the big...
Voice is a terrible control technology. Of course, voice is there. Voice is the most exquisite thing for human-to-human interaction. I don't want to drive a car with my voice. I don't want to fly a jet with my voice. I use my voice for kind of low bandwidth, just-in-time, ad hoc queries and interactions. It's a great way to ask Alexa the weather. It's a great way to dictate an address into Google Maps. It is a terrible way to do control, but your day is saturated by control problems, not by, how do I get out, a phrase into Google search to be able to get something back. So I feel like voice, we've comically overhyped the utility of voice as a means of machine interactions. It has a role, but it has nothing like the role that real control, continuous control and discrete control that we offer will have in the future.
So, Reardon, I want to get more into your product, into some of these use cases like VR especially, and I also want to talk to you a bit more about your team and sort of how you hire. I think you mentioned in this conversation, I've heard it from others, you've got arguably the deepest bench of machine learning talent in the country. You compete with Google and Facebook for talent. I'm really curious sort of how the challenges you face as a business person in this field. And I also have some philosophical questions for you based on the kind of work you do. I'm curious what your thoughts will be on that. But for those listening, you can find out more about our subscription through our Patreon page, or go to hiddenforces.com and check out the subscription page, and you can learn how to listen to our overtime. But Reardon, thank you for spending this full episode with me.
Thanks so much.
And that was my episode with Thomas Reardon. I want to thank Dr. Reardon for being on my program. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at CMD Design Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.